All right, welcome back to our roundtable. Sorry to have interrupted you there. Just if you were to answer my question, is with the developments that or maybe it's 5 years old, I may be wrong, but it's recent, right? Following the restructuring of the OAU to AU, right? You know, then South Africa joining BRICS, etc. It seems to me that there is already a trajectory, right? Are you saying that even that has to be questioned and come under scrutiny about whether that's their way to go in establishing these multilateral institutions?
Well, Africa is an interesting case because demonstrates is a need for a new set of models. And these models are being experimented with. The other thing that it demonstrates is a clash between the old model and these potential new models. One of the reasons why the African Free Trade Agreement has been a struggle in developing is because the old colonial relationships that Africa has with the former colonial masters are so very, very strong. And what we are seeing is how one can dominate the other, or maybe have the possibility of a new hybrid formula going into the future. Because the reality of where we sit, and you saw this in the reluctance of certain of the larger economies on the continent to join this free trade agreement, is the way up between what gets lost from the old relationships in favor of the new relationships. But you're also seeing a reinforcement of many of the colonial relationships through the various Africa summits, whether it's
China, Africa, Japan, Africa, and so on.
Correct.
Tends to confuse a little bit. And then you've got the G20, Dr. Mcbright, right, that then invites, cherry picks, invites 3 countries from the continent or 4, I don't know, the few countries, right, not all 54, and then they to join in this conversation of the big 7 or big, I don't know whether it's 7 or 8, I think one dropped out, right? Please delve in there for me. I mean, do you find this multilateralism that in fact it is taking us forward or backward, or is it simply symbolic stuff that in fact even if a country decided to opt out of it, right, they will lose little in terms of the work they're supposed to do to uplift their own citizens?
Okay, so multilateralism in the case of Africa is indispensable. I mean, a basic definition of multilateralism is that it's the practice basically of coordinating national policies among 3 or more countries, and basically towards some common interest or aspiration. And in the case of Africa, there is a whole lot that we have in common in terms of aspirations and interests. One of them is what you mentioned, which is intra-regional trade among East African countries. The idea with multilateralism is that you should operate under one common framework, have a common position, and leverage your position on your position in terms of how you trade and relate to each other. So to me, it is indispensable. But how is multilateralism orchestrated? It's orchestrated through institutions. It's orchestrated through the REX, SADC, the institutions that you mentioned, and all these culminate to the African Union at a continental level. It's an indispensable platform. For instance, if you want to trade, you have to have some convergence in terms of your policies, some convergence in terms of how you outlay your infrastructure across borders and so on. That can only be orchestrated through multilateralism, and the platform that I've mentioned, the regional economic communities and the African Union provide that. So it is not a question of whether it is useful or not, it's a question of how effective these platforms are actually serving.
Are they effective?
Yes, they are effective. I mean, there's been tremendous progress. Remember, you know, when you look at Africa, you should consider that we have the youngest states, which were formed totally different from the way the states were formed in Europe and the United States. In Africa, states were formed from a legacy, a colonial legacy, and the interest in terms of how the states were formed. The countries we call our countries or borders now, and so from when we say we had independence in the early 60s up until the late 90s, these countries were still on a national nationhood forming project. That's a prerequisite for multilateralism to work. First, countries have to define themselves. They have to have an identity. They have to agree as a nation what their identity and aspirations are. Then from there you move on to the to the multilateral stage. And so, yes, there's been tremendous progress.
Are we setting the standards low for multilateralism, though, if only 15%, right, of countries, or rather our intra-trade levels are at 15% compared to the other continents who have, as you say, maybe they have been there longer, and maybe that would be your answer.
Yes,
right?
well,
Secondly, if you look at another example of a simple thing like being able to travel to different countries, right? I think that the issue of a uni visa, for example, has been in discussion for as long as I could read.
In addition to what
and it still doesn't exist.
Yes, in addition to what my colleague has mentioned about the challenges on intra-regional trade, we must understand that our economies were also initially conceived and structured to service colonial centers.
Yeah.
So we were basically providing raw materials for Europe just a few decades ago. When it came to the role of our economies in the global market, it was just to provide raw materials. And so we're basically producing the same products for the global market, and there was very little interest to trade amongst ourselves. As you say, the colonial economic structures were still dominant for up until probably about 10, 15 years ago. But there's been progress. We are looking at our own intra-regional value chains within the region. What is it that we can do to add value, beneficiation, so that we can trade amongst ourselves? This is not an overnight project. You know, when you look at Europe, you're talking of states that are hundreds and hundreds of years old. In fact, the nation state, as we know it, what we call the state, the Westphalia state, under which the model of all states has been derived from, was conceived in 1648 in Berlin, after 30 years of conflict in Europe. And we're looking at African states from 1960s. It's just about half a century. So if you ask me if there's been progress...
So you are saying we must not be impatient, essentially. But let's hear what Qanti has to say. What's your analysis? I mean, multilateralism, is it, in the first place, it's been taken serious enough for us to be able to learn lessons? I mean, we meant water as an example, right? There may be various countries that have, for example, advanced on water technologies, etc., so that we... existence in and participation in all of these networks, from BRICS to, you know, the UN itself and so on, to learn quicker so that we don't have to make the mistakes that those states that have been in existence for hundreds of years have made. What's your view? I
think that's a very important question. I mean, look, multilateralism in itself, every country joins for national interest. So it's always that interesting bit in which we want to join, for example, BRICS, as a multilateral platform so that we can serve our own national interests. And I think what has been interesting now is that actually some of these institutions are almost like a protest to the current system. So you find, you know, BRICS was, you know, we need to get together and put this together, this power club, in order to protest some of the things that we've seen in terms of, you know, the global system, which I think for the most part has been sort of a power-sharing agreements between a few countries. So in that sense, what we're kind of seeing now is people trying to find a new way of doing things. And I actually agree with my colleague here about some of the issues that we face in terms of, especially in Africa, around how we actually create, you know, this, you know, Africa Trade Agreement. Because I think for a long time, people have had this relationship that are very stable and there for a long time. But also trying to, but have found themselves anyway manipulated. I think there's an example President Thabo would make when they were discussing this whole thing about the African Union in that sense, and how they must communicate, in that a European investor could come to Togo and say, listen, we want this trade agreement with you, and then if they try to negotiate, they say, you know, we just spoke to the Ghanaians, and the Ghanaians are doing much better. They're giving us a much better tax deal or a much better free trade deal than you. So if you don't want to take it, we'll just go with them. And it created, so the view was then, could you create a system that could be an improvement on that, you know, survive manipulation, be able to actually work on common interests, because of course we know that the colonial project has been very good at dividing and rule. So I suspect part of it, but now we're struggling, of course, because we still think that if we go and actually join this, you know, common trade agreement, we might lose our existing relationships. So that multilateral positioning in the African space is almost trumped by the national interest of every single person, because they can't see almost the bigger picture, as it were. And I think in some way, if we are looking for these grand solutions, I mean, we need cooperation beyond that, so we can see solutions, for example, that Des talks about, in water and sanitation sector.
Yeah.
The stuff that other people are already succeeding in. What
Yes.
could we benefit? What could we share? We know we got smaller states and bigger states in Africa, and some solutions can only work.
Yeah. But
if
what's
we
your
actually
assessment?
cooperate.
Is the multilateral system as it exists now geared towards that kind of solution sharing, etc., or we're sort of fixing this as we go along? In other words, we have not sort of figured out what is the best things to get out of these collaborations other than multiple meetings and visions. Now this Vision 2063, next minute there's another, either some kind of a compact, etc., etc. Do you think it's at the moment geared towards the solution sharing? And
yeah.
So
it isn't, I think, at the moment. We need to work much harder at it. I think one of the things is that there's a constant fear US or the next China, or who is going to benefit more or less in these things. So I think there's also that protest is still there, and I think that's the one thing that we need to get past, because there's negotiations. If we can all decide, we know this is good for us. I mean, simple things like that, where we think, you can have an international organization trying to help, so an NGO saying, well, if we club together, we could do this solution. And then it's whether or not South Africa is introducing to the rest of the continent a new power. Or also, these discussions are still there. They're very powerful.
Yeah.
So I think it's still very much part of fear, part of national interest, part of still a struggle to actually say, look, we need a new resolution. Because I think at the level we are going, we're definitely not going to succeed.
Yeah. I want to pick that up after the break and lead us on. For example, if you look at BRICS, and I wanted to ask Lesley Maasdorp this, right? That South Africa finds itself now in a bloc where it's the only African country, right? How does it relate with how does it bring the other countries into that BRICS? And why in the first place did those BRICS, when they were BRICS, why did they pick South Africa alone? Why not Nigeria? Why didn't they pick Kenya, right? Or even Ethiopia, that were amongst the top 3. In fact, at some point, South Africa was not even at the top of that economic agenda. And I want to understand how you guys understand that kind of shifting of power blocks around the world and what we should make of all of that. Let's take a break. And after the break, we carry on with the conversation. We're on a round table talking multilateralism. And I've got big brains around the table here trying to make me understand how it all works. Let's take